Black Power movement was an extremely important time for the United States. It was the period where civil and equal rights were being fought for in America. Today, our group is going to give you some of the important people, groups, and events of this era. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968, an event that sent shockwaves reverberating around the world. A Baptist minister and founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King had led the civil rights movement since the mid-1950s, using a combination of impassioned speeches and nonviolent protests to fight segregation and achieve significant civil rights advances in African Americans. His assassination led to an outpouring of anger among Black Americans, as well as a period of national mourning that helped speed the way for an equal housing bill that would be the last significant legislative achievement of the civil rights era. Though Blacks and whites alike mourned King's passing, the killing in some ways served to widen the rift between Black and white Americans, as many saw King's assassination as a rejection of their vigorous pursuit of equality through the nonviolent resistance he had championed. His murder, like the killing of Malcolm X in 1965, radicalized many modern African American activists, fueling the growth of the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s and early 1970s. King has remained the most widely known African American leader of his era, the most public face of the civil rights movement, along with its most eloquent voice. In 1946, at the age of 21, Malcolm X was sent to prison on a burglary conviction. It was there he encountered the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, whose members are popularly known as Black Muslims. The Nation of Islam advocated Black nationalism and racial separatism and condemned Americans of European descent as immoral. Muhammad's teachings had a strong effect on Malcolm, who entered into an intense program of self-education and took the last name X to symbolize his stolen African identity. After 6 years, Malcolm was released from prison and became a loyal and effective member of the Nation of Islam in Harlem, New York. In contrast with civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X advocated self-defense and the liberation of African Americans by any means necessary. A fiery orator, Malcolm was admired by the African American community in New York and around the country. On February 21st, 1965, 1 week after his home was firebombed, Malcolm X was shot to death by the Nation of Islam members while speaking at a rally of his organization in New York City. The March on Washington was planned by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Austin. The March on Washington occurred on August 28, 1963. It was one of the largest political rallies in United States history for any human rights movements. There was a gathering at Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to march in a protest for African Americans. The march was to gain civil and economic rights for African Americans and more jobs and opportunities for these African Americans. There was roughly over 200,000 people that gathered together to protest and draw attention to African Americans and inequality. During this March on Washington, standing in front of the memorial in front of thousands and thousands of people, Martin Luther King Jr. uplifted the African Americans during this march. Martin Luther King gave his famous speech here that soon became known as the I Have a Dream speech, which he was calling for an end to racism. This march credited to the pass of the Civil Rights Act of 1960. The Black Panther Party was originally named the Black Panther Party for self-defense, but they eventually ended up shortening their name. The Black Panthers were dressed in black berets and had black leather jackets, and had established more than 60 community assistance programs, such as medical service and legal aid instructions. The Black Panthers were founded in Oakland in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Jay. The original purpose of the Black Panther movement was to protect and to stand up for African Americans against police brutality. Police brutality was at its worst during the time, and Black Panthers eventually gained attention from people all around the world, and police brutality began to decrease slowly. The movement eventually developed into a Marxist revolutionary group that called for the arming of all African Americans and also for the release of all African Americans from jail. In the late 1960s, the Black Panthers exceeded over 2,000 members and eventually were a success for the African American community. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Massachusetts. He became the 35th President of the United States and was in office from 1961 till his death in 1963. He is well known for how he passed a bill called the Civil Rights Act on June 11, 1963. This bill gave all Americans, regardless of race, to be served in places like hotels, restaurants, theaters, and many more. It also allowed the protection for the right to vote. During a parade for his campaign in Texas, JFK was shot while riding in a motorcade on November 22, 1963. The gunshot caught him on the neck, and he was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was confident about being reelected for president as he was making rounds around the country for making world peace. The bill of making civil rights still had to go through the Senate, but eventually it got passed when Lyndon B. Johnson took office in 1960. JFK will be remembered as one who wanted to make peace in America, and it was still done even after his assassination.